New Growth on an Old Tree, The Life and Legacy of John F. Funk, celebrating 150 years of Prairie Street Mennonite Church in Elkhart, Indiana. If you stop by Prairie Street Mennonite Church, you might have a chance to meet our pastors, Sunitha Millsaps and Quinn Brennecke. But as you enter the building, you might notice this historical sign with a funky name, John Funk, who founded the congregation in 1871 and made Elkhart a seedbed of new growth for the national and global Mennonite Church. You would not readily find a picture of John Funk hanging anywhere in the building, and to be sure, he looked pretty dour in his last years. So sometimes we dress him up a little. Some of us prefer this picture because it shows our congregational founder as a young man when he was full of vigor. And did he ever produce? He ran successful businesses, planted our congregation, and set vision for what would become enduring mission, publishing, and educational institutions of the Mennonite Church. John Fretz Funk was raised at this home in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and Line Lexington Mennonite Church was his home congregation. Most Mennonites in America at this time worshiped in German and were conservative. Mennonites viewed even Sunday school as a worldly invention. But young Funk wanted to learn and attended a Welsh Baptist Sunday school where he memorized 1,600 Bible verses. He was a quick student and at age 19 was himself hired as a public school teacher. When asked by Mennonite parents why he taught the worldly subject of geography, he explained that it would help students better understand the Holy Land. Among his young scholars was Saloma Kratz, who later would become his wife. At age 20, Funk took classes at nearby Freeland Seminary, founded by a progressive Mennonite who later became Presbyterian. The school promised parents that their sons, quote, would be exposed to none of the allurements to dissipation and vice that beset youth in our larger towns and cities. Most American Mennonites were rural people, keeping their values separate from the world. But to the city, Funk was drawn. When he was 9 years old, his sister Mary Ann married Jacob Beidler. The couple moved to Illinois, then the far west of the United States, and eventually settled in Chicago. There, Jacob Beidler started a lumber business and became Presbyterian. While Funk was still teaching school in Pennsylvania, Beidler offered him a job. After due consideration and counsel with the home folks, Funk said later, I decided to accept it. As he traveled westward, Funk reported in his diary that the train proceeded, quote, with rapid speed toward the great money-making metropolis of the West. America was in an era of wealth and consumption, and Funk seemed eager to participate. He arrived in Chicago on a cold day in April 1857. The city was booming, with a population approaching 100,000. There was little urban planning and not much glamour. But with so much construction underway, it was a fantastic place for a lumber business. Funk took business courses in Chicago at Bryant and Stratton's Mercantile College. In an 1860 letter, he said he was still undecided about staying in Chicago or moving back to Pennsylvania. The desire for wealth, he said, might, quote, overbalance the love of home, friends, and social comfort. Funk worked first at Jacob Beidler's lumber yard, one of many such as this in Chicago. But with Beidler's blessing and support, in 1861, he formed his own enterprise, McMullen, Funk and Company, working with an Irish Catholic business partner named James McMullen. This 1868 drawing, looking westward, shows Funk's lumberyard just across the Chicago River from the northwest corner of what today we call the Loop. A photograph looking north shows the lumberyard shortly after Funk left Chicago. The schooner imported lumber from across Lake Michigan. Today, the old McMullen and Funk lumberyard is a parking lot. The day after his arrival in Chicago, Funk attended Third Presbyterian Church. He was not entirely impressed with the young preacher who read what Funk described as an ingenious sermon. He would do better for a lawyer, in my estimation, Funk noted. Funk attended here for years without becoming a member. Protestant denominations at this time were in the heyday of Sunday school, often a form of outreach. Funk became a teacher in this ecumenical evangelical movement that sought the betterment of disadvantaged and immigrant youth, sometimes in patronizing ways. Funk worked alongside another school teacher, 20-year-old shoe salesman Dwight L. Moody. All his life, Funk admired Moody, who went on to become the leading voice of 19th century American evangelicalism. In the autumn of Funk's first year in Chicago, the national economy collapsed in the panic of 1857. Stocks plummeted, banks failed, and investors panicked. In New York City, a few businessmen met at noon to pray. The idea spread. Soon prayer groups proliferated in cities across the North and in Canada in what became the businessmen's revival. Prayers and exhortations were limited to 5 minutes per person, and no controverted points were to be discussed. But Funk cared about controverted points, especially slavery. He was a member of the Wide Awakes, activists who called for an end to slavery and marched 10,000 strong in Chicago. Funk also became a charter member of the Chicago YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association. People in these movements saw their activities as a way of improving society. Funk maintained ties with Third Presbyterian despite his unease with the expensive new building. Here, in January 1858, in the midst of the national revival, he attended evangelistic meetings and gave his life more fully to Christ. He wrote in his diary, "Let the remainder of my days be spent in the service of my God." That evangelical conversion changed the course of Funk's life. He wanted to be baptized Mennonite, but there were no Mennonite churches in Chicago. So in 1859, he made a short visit to Pennsylvania to receive instruction and baptism. That trip also gave opportunity for courtship with 20-year-old Saloma Kratz. 5 years later, in 1864, he would return briefly to Pennsylvania to marry the girl he loved. Back in Chicago, Funk on weekends rode the caboose of a freight train 60 miles to a small Mennonite congregation near Gardner, Illinois. Services were in German, but the congregation called Funk to preach in English. The congregation at Gardner was a vital link to his Mennonite heritage, and Illinois Mennonites ordained Funk to the ministry. About the time of Funk's conversion, Dwight Moody, the shorter man on this picture, opened a Sunday school in a slum of Chicago. By 1861, Moody had abandoned his commercial interests to concentrate on social and evangelistic work, reaching out especially to immigrant children. He famously used his missionary pony to get around poor neighborhoods and give rides to children. Soon, hundreds of children took part in Moody's Sunday schools in multiple locations. Prominent themes that emerged in the following decades of Moody's ministry were new birth conversion, the trustworthiness of the Bible, social reform with accent on care for the poor, Christian education and publishing, and ecumenical evangelical relationships. These also became themes of Funk's life. Funk, however, returned to his Mennonite roots, while Moody remained non-denominational. Funk, seen in the left photo with some of his students, was a superintendent in one of Moody's Sunday schools, a teacher in another, and a student in a third. Saloma wrote in a letter to her family, "They have a mission Sunday school here. Children come from all classes and denominations, and some are pretty hard-looking." This urban mission work shaped Funk at a time when most American Mennonites still were suspicious of the city. "Only a church for jackrabbits should be built in the sticks," he would say years later. Funk wanted Mennonites to become more culturally and missionally relevant. This, however, risked assimilating a distinctive Anabaptist subculture into dominant American values. Funk himself enjoyed patriotic activities and supported Abraham Lincoln's presidential bid. When the Civil War broke out, Funk celebrated what he called the glorious mission of the Union Army to limit, perhaps even abolish, slavery. On July 4, 1861, Funk got up early and, quote, "hoisted the flag, fired a salute of 6 shots with my revolver over it, went home and got breakfast, then went to work." He did more shooting at midday. Despite his patriotic fervor, because of Christian conviction, he did not join the army, but paid the exemption fee. Dwight Moody also did not fight. In this respect, Moody said, "I am a Quaker." The Civil War dragged on for years, and Funk was appalled by the suffering and moral degradation it caused. Early in the war, the federal government established Camp Douglas military base at the south edge of Chicago. By 1862, this facility was receiving Confederate prisoners of war, housed in 48 crowded barracks at the rear of the base. Dwight Moody saw the military base and prisoner of war camp as an evangelistic opportunity and helped organize ministry there to Union soldiers and Confederate prisoners. Funk participated in this outreach to men whom most Northerners considered traitors. Like all Civil War prison camps, conditions were harsh. During the course of the conflict, Camp Douglas held some 26,000 captives, and more than 4,000 died there. Today, their bodies lie in a mass grave under this memorial at Oak Woods Cemetery, south of Chicago. By 1863, Funk no longer was ambivalent about war. He issued his first publication, a booklet entitled "Warfare, Its Evils, Our Duty." He addressed it to Mennonite churches throughout the United States, attempting to speak to a broad spectrum of Anabaptist peoples. He wrote, "Thousands have been maimed and cut, as it were, limb from limb, and thousands more lie cold in death, and still the work goes on. Shall we also take part in this fratricidal strife? Shall we who are the professed followers of the Prince of Peace lay aside reason and religion, give way to our passions, and bear the sword to execute the judgments which belong to God alone?" At the time of the Civil War, there was no national Mennonite organization of any sort in North America, or even a center of communication. Funk set out to address that need. In January 1864, he launched a monthly newspaper called the Herald of Truth in English and in German. devoted to the interests of the denomination of Christians known as the Mennonites. The Apostle Paul says, "Be of one mind," he wrote in an editorial. "How can we join hands and be all of the same mind until we know what the views of each are? A newspaper will afford the means to different brethren having different views and living under different circumstances to become acquainted." With a new sense of mission, Funk in 1866 sold his share of the lumber business and went full-time into publishing and ministry. Beidler and McMullen both went on to become millionaires and could not understand Funk's decision. In 1867, 32-year-old John moved to Indiana with Saloma and their infant daughter Martha. They apparently were the first Mennonites to settle in the city of Elkhart. After renting space for his printing operation, Funk purchased what was then an undeveloped lot at 320 South Main. There, he and his younger brother Abram put up the structure at the right end of this row of commercial buildings. They named it J.F. Funk and Brother English and German Printing Office, Bookbindery, and Bookstore. A small Mennonite congregation began to meet in the building on Sundays. This 1885 survey map shows details of what then was called Mennonite Publishing Company. Book sales and typesetting were in the front of the building. The press room and bindery were in the rear. Funk's business had ready access to the train station to receive supplies and to mail publications. The Funks purchased a house with adjacent property on nearby Division Street. They petitioned the city to establish a new street called Jariat Court into their property for several more houses, one of which they occupied for decades. In the 1870 federal census, we see that 8 people were in the Funk household. 35-year-old John, listed as an editor and publisher, 32-year-old Saloma, keeping house, daughters Martha and Phoebe, Abraham K. Funk, John's brother and business partner, a printer from Pennsylvania, a printer apprentice from Germany, and a domestic servant named Sarah. Back in Chicago, the Great Fire of 1871 devastated much of the city, but spared the lumber yard Funk had sold to his business partner. Downtown Elkhart expanded around the printing office in the following decades. Mennonite Publishing Company remained where the arrow appears on this photo. Today, this same city block looks like this, the Civic Plaza, with a clock tower where the publishing company stood. Funk, at far left in this 1886 picture, attracted capable Mennonite business people and intellectuals from across the continent. The team of employees grew. On this picture, we see Saloma standing behind John with her hand on his shoulder. We have few pictures of Saloma, but John could not have sustained his demanding schedule without her partnership. In addition to raising a family and hosting many guests, Saloma vetted manuscripts for publication, did proofreading, and helped address periodicals for mailing. She and John also carried a load of grief. 4 of their 6 children died young of childhood disease. Mennonite Publishing Company primarily did commercial printing. It grew until 1908, when they printed and mailed 1 million catalogs for the Elkhart Carriage and Harness Company. But Funk's passion was publishing religious material, especially for Mennonites. Major books he produced included The Martyr's Mirror and The Complete Works of Menno Simons. The first 5 books Funk published were on the Christian response to war. By 1907, there were 65 employees at Mennonite Publishing Company. Funk, seen here in his office, set high standards of conduct for employees. He worked long hours and loved coffee. When he was in his 80s, a young worker asked Funk if he knew that coffee is poison. "If so," Funk replied, "it must be a very slow one." The Mennonite congregation that met in the printing office soon started gathering in members' homes, then needed a meeting house. With his own money, Funk purchased the lot where Prairie Street Church stands today. The congregation put up this facility and held their first service here on November 26, 1871. The first communion service was on Christmas Day. When Mennonites in southern Russia came under increasing pressure to participate in the military, Funk printed news of their plight and effectively served as a travel agent for Russian Mennonite immigrants such as these. For native peoples of the Great Plains, this was an era of dislocation and death, as American soldiers with superior weapons prevailed. Railroads quickly followed, and vast tracts of agricultural land became available to settlers from the east. In the 1870s, thousands of German-speaking Russian Mennonite immigrants passed through Elkhart on their way to settlements in the west. Prairie Street Church hosted many of these as they came through the city on the railroad. 24 Russian immigrant families arrived at this Elkhart train station early on a Sunday morning in July 1874. During the previous night, Funk's infant daughter Grace had died. Though exhausted with grief, John got up when leaders of the immigrant group knocked on his door. He arranged for a bakery and a grocery store to open on Sunday so the travelers could buy provisions. The visitors stayed a month in a vacant house near Prairie Street Church before continuing on to Kansas. This old train station still stands today. A few months after this incident, Funk spent a fruitless day seeking lodging in Elkhart for another group of immigrants. In his diary, he wrote, "Became completely disgusted and tired of such nonsensical fools as we have here in Elkhart. 100 houses stand idle and empty, yet people rather have them stand empty than rent them to persons who want to occupy them. They seem afraid of these people." With Mennonite communities developing across northern Indiana, in 1882, church leaders decided that, quote, "means should be collected for the purpose of defraying the expenses incurred in traveling to visit scattered members and churches." Funk and others at Prairie Street promptly provided a structure for that purpose, forming a Mennonite Evangelizing Committee. In addition to raising money to visit the Mennonite diaspora, the Evangelizing Committee stated in 1883 that they also would raise funds to, quote, "preach the gospel where our church and doctrines are not known." It was the first organization for evangelistic and mission work in the North American Mennonite Church. Funk's mission vision reached beyond the United States. In 1897, he published a book on the Great Famine in India, written by Prairie Street Church member George Lambert. Funk and others from the publishing company formed a Home and Foreign Relief Committee and raised $200,000 for India famine relief. In 1899, Funk and other mission-minded leaders sent the first North American Mennonite missionaries to India, the beginning of what today is called Mennonite Mission Network. A generation later, when people of southern Russia faced starvation after the Bolshevik Revolution, multiple North American Mennonite groups collaborated to send relief. The first meeting of a central committee for this effort was at Prairie Street in July 1920. By 1922, the Central Committee was providing 25,000 food rations a day in Russia. Out of that initiative came Mennonite Central Committee, still a robust global relief and service agency today. In 1894, academic-minded people from Prairie Street established the Elkhart Institute of Science, Industry, and the Arts. In 1896, they built this structure across the street from Prairie Street Church. Both men and women were on the faculty and in the student body. Soon needing more space, Elkhart Institute moved to Goshen in 1903 and became Goshen College. Funk never forgot Chicago and the evangelical vision he learned from Dwight Moody. In 1893, several of Funk's employees and church members, with his blessing, moved to Chicago to start the Chicago Mennonite Home Mission, a project that continued for half a century. The last years of Funk's life sometimes were difficult. He served as bishop of a cluster of nearby Mennonite congregations, but lost that in 1902 when some experienced him as authoritarian. He lost much of his savings in a 1903 bank failure, and a 1906 fire at the printing company did enough damage to push his business into bankruptcy. For too little money, he sold his business to the denomination, who moved it to Scottsdale, Pennsylvania. Some of Funk's former employees continued a printing business at the old site in Elkhart. Funk continued to function as a pastor at Prairie Street the rest of his life. The enduring legacy of John Funk is considerable. He was directly responsible for the Herald of Truth and other publications of the Mennonite Church. He founded Prairie Street Mennonite Church. His Mennonite publishing company was a forerunner of today's Mennomedia. The Mennonite Evangelizing Committee he helped establish eventually evolved into today's Mennonite Mission Network. People mentored by Funk took initiative in projects that became Chicago Mennonite Home Mission, Goshen College, and Mennonite Central Committee. Dwight Moody died in 1899, but others carried on his work. In 1925, Moody Memorial Church was inaugurated in Chicago. The vast auditorium was full for a weekend of celebrations. Then on Monday, there was a festival of reminiscence for people who were involved in Moody's Sunday school programs. The Moody Church News that month reported that hundreds gathered in this auditorium and, quote, several intimate friends of D.L. Moody spoke briefly. Among these, Bishop John Funk, who is 91 years of age. Funk drank deeply from evangelical fountains. He inspired a lethargic Mennonite people to engage society, learn ecumenically, think globally, and seek unity. Evangelicalism and Anabaptism cross-fertilized in Funk's work, and he always based that in the worshiping church community. He emphasized personal conversion, Christian community, denominational unity, mission, peacemaking, and social justice. a combination that still perhaps is the only viable future for North American Mennonites today. Whatever its strengths, American evangelicalism also had downsides: individualism, leadership structures that remained white, male, and elitist, mission work that could be patronizing. While Moody himself was a pacifist, evangelicalism sometimes found expression in idolatrous nationalism and structural racism. Neither Funk nor Mennonites of subsequent generations have been immune to such tendencies. On his 89th birthday in 1924, Funk preached what he expected would be his last sermon at Prairie Street Church. Nellie Mann, mother of current Prairie Street member Dorothy Horst, was at that service and took notes that capture the evangelical core of Funk's life. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is in me, bless his holy name. This beautiful sunny day reminds me of the day in 1871, 54 years ago, when this meeting house was first used. We organized the church with 7 members and 20 members in Sunday school, 4 classes. For other foundation can no one lay than that which is laid in Jesus Christ. Funk preached the first sermon in this church. Hopes the church will stand on the firm foundation of the rock, Christ Jesus. Has been a member of this church for more than 60 years, a minister for 59 years. May be my last talk to this congregation, but I hope leaders may be faithful in pointing souls to Jesus. The Lord bless you and keep you. By all accounts, Funk was content and gracious in his later years. He simply could not find it either possible or permissible for a Christian to hold any feeling against those who had done him wrong, a grandchild later recalled. Funk died a financially poor man in 1930. In the Mennonite Church archives is this picture of him as an elderly man. On the back is written, John F. Funk, at entrance to his upstairs office, a poor picture. Wearing a Prince Albert coat he picked up. Poor man, his clothes were pretty terrible sometimes, but they were the best he could do in his poverty. Thank you, John Funk, for what you gave to Prairie Street Mennonite Church, to the Elkhart community, and to the global Anabaptist communion.